I'm Keely Robinson.
And I'm Danielle Needham, and we will be presenting on the fear of motherhood for African American women.
Before we begin our analysis, it is important to know the context during this time. During the 1950s, African Americans were fighting for their rights, the right to vote, and the right of equality. 100 years prior to the Civil Rights Movement, slavery was abolished. However, this didn't end the racial segregation. African Americans still fought against discrimination and a lack of freedom. The Jim Crow laws attempted to marginalize the African American community. The laws were in place for years and prevented African Americans from basic rights, such as education and obtaining a good job. Those who tried to detest the laws were punished, facing arrest, violence, and even death. African Americans also lived in fear of lynchings. White people used lynchings to torment African Americans. Lynchings were often publicized events in which African Americans were hung from trees and brutally tortured. Many African Americans who fought against laws such as segregation were lynched. The Jim Crow laws and lynchings all played a role in the civil rights movement in which African Americans fought to eliminate segregation.
Now that you have a little background, I will present our thesis. The thesis for this project is Kate Chopin's short story, Desiree's Baby, Hamilton County Morgue Records, and Angelina Grimke's play, Rachel, emphasize the racial restrictions for mothers in the 19th and 20th centuries. These texts demonstrate the inequitable struggles African American women face during motherhood, such as fear, violence, and shame that white mothers do not encounter. Time has done nothing to aid Black women and their fears, with racial violence becoming more prevalent. First, I will discuss Desiree's Baby by Kate Chopin to demonstrate society is unaccepting of Black people. This is a story about an adopted young woman named Desiree Valmonde, who marries a wealthy Louisiana man. The first quote I'm going to examine is, quote, Monsieur Valmonde grew practical and wanted things well considered. That is, the girl's obscure origin. Armand looked into her eyes and did not care. He was reminded that she was nameless. This passage comes from the point in Desiree's Baby, in which Armand, a man from a family of rich Louisiana plantation owners, wants to marry the adopted Desiree. Desiree's adopted parents do not care her origin and takes her in and raises her. When Armand desires to marry their daughter, as we see in this quote, they become tentative. Her father is described as practical, meaning he is more concerned with the realities of the world than ideas or desires. Specifically, Armand's desire to marry Desiree without deeper consideration for her unknown past. Despite the desire for marriage, Monsieur Valmonde is aware of his daughter's unfortunate disposition. They do not know her origin. In relation to the realities of the world, Monsieur Valmonde, then, is aware that coming from a certain background would be undesirable. The world that they live in, as the Valmondes demonstrate they are aware, is prejudiced towards certain groups. Because of the context of this text, knowing it takes place in Louisiana in times of plantations, and the uses of racial slurs as common language throughout the text, we can deduce at this point in the text, Monsieur Valmonde fears his daughter may have a Black relative of some sort in her bloodline. Having Valmonde be aware of this, quote, practical nature of her origin describes that he knows that the world they live in is unsafe and unaccepting of Black people. Establishing the world in this text, antebellum America, as unsafe for Black people through the hesitant Valmondes, we can now move to the racism affecting motherhood. So, further in the text, Chopin writes, quote, moreover, he no longer loved her, because of the unconscious injury she had brought upon his home and his name, end quote. This passage comes after Armand finds out their baby is partly Black and accuses Desiree of being, quote, not white in the page prior. He continues this conversation by asking Desiree to leave and proceeds to burn all of her and the child's belongings. This complete shift in Armand's manner demonstrates the hostilities Armand has towards Black people. Despite not caring about her unknown origin and namelessness before their marriage, as she presented as a white woman, after he thinks she could be non-white, he falls out of love. Through describing their child, who was conceived out of love and marriage, as a quote, injury to their family, it describes the position Black people have in the society at the time of the book. Injury means that this could hurt the family and damage their reputation. This demonstrates that Armand is aware and a part of a society that sees being Black as lesser than being white. While Desiree is believed to be white towards the beginning of the story, she is accepted into society through her marriage, as is her child. When her child is discovered to have a Black heritage through his darker skin tone, the world, specifically his father Armand, refuses to accept him as part of the family and as part of his society. Desiree is subject to shame, as she and her child are kicked out of her home with Armand. In addition, Armand is ashamed that he believes he married a Black woman, as he demonstrates by burning all of her and his child's belongings. The unsafe environment in antebellum America, depicted by Chopin, brings shame to Desiree for mothering a Black child.
The Hamilton County morgue records serve as our primary source. These are the records of bodies taken to the morgue from 1887 to 1930 in Hamilton County, Ohio. It is important to note bodies taken to the morgue were there for a variety of reasons, like suspicious deaths, lack of known relatives, or other unknown circumstances. In these records, we investigated the deaths of specifically African American individuals to show how Black women face fear regarding motherhood.
So here we see 3 examples of death records, specifically of murdered people of color from the Hamilton County morgue in Ohio. First, to the far left, we see Robert F. Burley's record. The record describes an individual named Robert who was murdered. It is noted that he was a, quote, colored man that was 31 years of age. He was killed from a stab wound in his head. Next, in the middle, we see the record for Minnie Franklin, who was murdered at 35. This individual was also described as being, quote, colored and had stab wounds to the groin area. Finally, on the far right, Fanny Bell is noted as being 28 years old and murdered by a gunshot wound. These are only 3 of the hundreds of records that are available. These 3 murders demonstrate the violence that existed in the 19th and 20th centuries towards people of color. Each murder is violent in nature, especially noting Minnie, who was stabbed in the groin area multiple times. In looking at a sample of 458 death records from this database, only 54, around 12%, were indicated to be, quote, colored people. In this same sample, there are 13 murders noted, in which 9 of the people murdered, which is around 70%, are described as, quote, colored. So to reiterate the numbers I just said and the numbers on your screen, despite being only 12% of the population in the sample, people of color represent around 70% of the murders committed in this sample. Here are 2 comparative pie charts, just so people can visualize the numbers I just described and you just saw on the last slide. This demonstrates the unbalanced violence that African American citizens had to face. Seeing these young Black individuals be murdered at alarmingly high rates furthers the fears Black mothers have. With race-based violence present, Black mothers must fear violence more often than white mothers, as we see from these charts.
I will now discuss Angelina Grimke's play, Rachel, to illustrate that Black mothers live in fear of losing their children. This play is about a young girl named Rachel. She believes God has created her to be a mother. As she grows older, she realizes that she cannot protect the Black and brown babies. The first quote I am going to analyze is, quote, "Those 4 days, she lay in bed hardly moving, scarcely speaking. Only her eyes seemed alive. I never saw such a wide, tragic look in my life. It was as though her soul had been mortally wounded, unquote. This quote is taken towards the end of the play. Rachel has adopted a son named Jimmy, whom she swears to protect. When he comes home from school one afternoon, after being bullied by white children, Rachel lays paralyzed in fear. Rachel believed that the world could not be cruel when it was full of black and brown babies. When Jimmy proves this wrong, Rachel wallows in misery. This passage helps demonstrate the fear Black mothers face, which white women don't. Black mothers are scared to let their children leave the safety of home. This is demonstrated by Rachel. She cannot fathom the pain she felt when her own child was called names and beaten with rocks. She shuts herself off from the world because she is afraid of losing her own child. Rachel isn't the only Black mother who deals with feelings of fear. Her own mother was afraid that she wouldn't be able to protect Rachel and her brother. The next quote I'm going to examine comes from earlier in the play. Quote, "Rachel, that's one of the things I can't save you from. They don't want you, dearies, when you and they grow up," unquote. Rachel's own mother is fearful of losing her children. In the play, we find out that Rachel's father and brother were killed in lynchings. Rachel's mother is constantly reminded of the pain she felt when losing her husband and son. She raised her children to obey the laws and keep their heads down, unlike her son and husband. During this instant, Rachel's white friend had called her the N-word. Her mother is instantly saddened by this news and is fearful that she cannot protect her own children from the cruelty of the world. She knows how hard the world treats African Americans, which we can see evident through the historical context mentioned earlier. Rachel's mother feels afraid that she cannot protect her children once they get older. They will be faced with the cruelty of the world by themselves. Continuing, Rachel begins to realize that, similar to her mother, she cannot protect the black and brown babies from the brutal world, which she thought was her plan. Quote, "How can life be so terrible when there are little children in the world? Terrible, terrible. That's the reason it is so terrible," unquote. Rachel is again instilled with fear. Her whole view on motherhood has changed. During this part in the play, a fellow mother has come to talk to Rachel about the harsh way her daughter was treated in school. Her daughter was called nasty names and even picked on by the white teacher. Rachel no longer views motherhood as a beautiful act, but rather she begins to fear it. Life is terrible because children, specifically Black children, are faced with the hardships of the world. Rachel begins to fall apart, changing her whole perspective of life. We can see how the cruelty of the world impacts Rachel as a mother. The world makes her fear becoming a mother because she cannot protect the children from violence. Although African Americans are now free with access to equal rights, racial discrimination is still prevalent throughout contemporary America. In 2020, the murder of George Floyd sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. George Floyd was a Black man who was killed by a police officer who knelt on his neck. Floyd continued to plead to the officer, telling him he couldn't breathe. The death of George Floyd led to protestings in which individuals fought for his justice. These protestings took place all over the world. This demonstrates the world, despite its advancements in laws, is not fully free of racism and racial violence. Because racial violence still exists today, mothers still have to fear the lives of their children more. Racism still exists today, and African American women are still faced with fear of their child never returning home. On your screen are some Black Lives Matter social media posts, and these all come from the Black Lives Matter Instagram page, which advocates for African Americans who have lost their lives at early ages or are still fighting for justice. The death of George Floyd encouraged many others to step forward and tell their stories. The Black Lives Matter movement allowed African Americans to fight for justice. The social media posts displayed on the screen show a few of the deaths in recent years. Although times have changed and African Americans have received more rights, this has not ended racial violence. The social media posts display just how cruel the world is to Black individuals. In one instance, a man was shot 60 times by police officers. These social media posts help to emphasize that mothers still live in fear of their children being mistreated. Just because their children have grown older does not mean the fear has gone away. These posts help illustrate the theme seen in Rachel. Mothers cannot protect their children from the cruelty of the world, even when they get older. A contemporary study in 2014 depicts the leading causes of death for Black children ages 15 through 19. On your screen is a screenshot of the study. The leading cause of death for Black children in this age category is homicide and legal interventions. In case you don't know what homicide is the act of killing another person, therefore meaning that many individuals have died of murder. This data shows that mothers still face fear of their children being murdered. It is also important to note that heart disease is below homicide and vehicle crashes. This data is important because it shows that racial violence is still an issue even in contemporary America.
In a 2021 study funded by Texas A&M University, researchers interviewed 7 Black mothers and asked them questions about their fears for motherhood over the course of 2 years, 2018 and 2019. The goal of this study was to understand and explore the lived experiences of stress described by Black mothers. The results note themes identified in the analysis of the various interviews, the more prevalent theme amongst the women being living in fear. Though it is normal for mothers to express fears related to children, the fear expressed by the mothers in this study were a lot more specific, as I will note later. Historically, as we discovered through morgue records and the texts, Black Americans have struggled throughout history due to racism. These challenges are present for Black mothers as they learn to navigate raising their child in a world suffocated by racial discrimination. It is noted that in this study, mothers indicated that their fear represented a daily concern for their children's lives. One theme of this study was the uncertainty these mothers expressed in keeping their children safe. This theme reveals the ineffectiveness Black women feel about changing the world. There is a sense of helplessness in protecting a child, particularly a Black male child, while living in a world that cannot be controlled. I will now read some quotes from these mothers to describe their feelings of uselessness and defeat with regards to living in American society. First, the subject Jayla expresses this useless feeling when stating, quote, "I just do my best to raise my child right. I don't see the world getting any better. I just see it getting worse and I feel bad. But I feel like it's nothing I can do, but just to do my best I can as a mother. I can't do nothing about the evil folks out there," end quote. Next, Diamond questions, quote, "How am I going to save them? I'm always aware of my surroundings, and sometimes I feel like I shouldn't have to be like that. But in the world we live in now, we have to," end quote. Finally, another subject, Rose, also expresses these fears with her concerns focused on the responsibility of preparing a child to live in a racist world and the uncertainty of how to do so. She says, quote, "How do I prepare him? Can I keep him safe? Can I protect him? How well can I prepare him for any adversities that he might face as a Black man?" End quote. These mothers all fear bringing their children into an unsafe world. Further, the mothers were asked what concerns they had in becoming a mother. One of the subjects, Diamond, responded bluntly, quote, "Them being killed," end quote. Throughout this interview, Diamond discussed her concerns for her children being killed 3 times. This concern was echoed by each mother independently, as these interviews were conducted separately. They focused explicitly on young Black males being killed doing what would seem like typical activities. They feared that their sons would be killed doing everyday activities, such as driving through a neighborhood, wearing a hoodie, or knocking on a friend's door, simply because they are Black. Jada, another subject, stated, quote, "So the one time he's maybe walking with his friends and he decides he's going to be cool and sag or something. These little things that he's going to do as a boy and a young man and just testing the waters as any normal child and young adult would, but those are things he can be killed for," end quote. Unfortunately, we have seen this recently. as this month, a Black 16-year-old boy was shot for knocking on the wrong door to pick up his sister. The shooter assumed he was breaking in. These fears due to racism are exclusive to Black mothers. This study demonstrates that due to violence towards Black people, specifically Black men and Black young men today, mothers still live in fear of their children being killed. When discussing worries and concerns about raising her Black son, Jada further states, quote, "That's not a stress that everybody has to carry. I think it is still tied to the larger picture that we have in this country overall," end quote. Jada here is alluding to the racism that plagues American society and media, representing that this is only something that Black mothers have to worry about.
We saw the inequitable struggles African American women face during motherhood, such as fear, like in the morgue records, and Rachel, violence, like in the morgue records, and shame, like in Desiree's baby, that white mothers do not encounter. Desiree's baby, Hamilton County morgue records, and Rachel demonstrate the violence African Americans faced through antebellum America and the fear it caused in African American mothers. We can see that Black women still live in fear that their children will be taken from them. The recent Black Lives Matter movement has done nothing to calm the fear Black mothers hold. In a recent contemporary study, we can see that many Black women still live in fear during motherhood due to the violent and prejudiced world they are living in. The similarities between antebellum America worlds in Chopin and Grimke's works, the world represented through the Hamilton County morgue records, and contemporary society represented through current events and studies are significant in that they demonstrate little to no progress has been made to ease the fears of African American mothers. These are our works cited. Thank you so much.